This video contains images and content generated or assisted by artificial intelligence.
Racist cop removes black girl from plane unaware her mother is a USS senator. A hush fell over the cabin as an unexpected confrontation erupted mid-flight. Passengers glanced around in confusion while a uniformed officer, his face set in a harsh scowl, marched up the aisle. A young black girl sat trembling by the window, unable to comprehend the accusation being hurled at her. In the space of a heartbeat, she found herself yanked from her seat, the cops sneering about people like you. What neither he nor the shocked onlookers knew was that this girl's mother was not just any parent, she was a high-profile United States senator. And she was ready to fight back. 13-year-old Faith Carter had been brimming with anticipation at Gate B-22 of American Airlines in Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. She was a bundle of nervous energy, shifting her weight from one foot to the other as she stared out the large pane windows at the planes parked and taxiing. She wore a grey hoodie, comfortable jeans, and carried a backpack featuring her favorite Marvel superheroes. Inside that bag, carefully folded and tucked away, was a cardigan her mother had given her, along with a note reminding her that, even when they were apart, they remained connected by an unbreakable bond. Faith's mother, Senator Monique Carter, was due to meet her in Washington, D.C. for a special event at the Capitol. She had told Faith, "You're going to do something big, sweetheart. One day, you'll stand on that Senate floor yourself." Though Faith was modest and easily shy, when it came to lofty praise, she couldn't suppress the excitement fluttering in her chest. At the last moment, an airline agent announced a change in departure gates. The family next to Faith groaned, the father complaining that the frequent gate changes were absolutely ridiculous. Still, Faith didn't let it dampen her spirits. She was used to flights and schedule changes thanks to her mother's busy life in politics. She clutched the pink carry-on her mother had insisted she bring a senator's daughter, can't travel light. Monique joked and followed the crowd. By the time Faith boarded the plane, the overhead bins were nearly full. She found her window seat next to a kindly older woman who introduced herself as Harriet Moore. Harriet noticed Faith struggled to hoist her carry-on above her head, so she reached up and helped her stow it away. Grateful, Faith smiled. She always liked meeting new people. One of her mother's key lessons for her was to open her heart to the stories of strangers. Settling in, Faith felt the gentle hum of the engines beneath her feet. Harriet chatted about her grandchildren, how proud she was, and how she hoped to see them during her brief stay in DCF. Faith, in turn, talked about how she was flying alone. Harriet asked, "Your parents are letting you fly by yourself?" with a friendly note of surprise. Faith admitted her mother's staff had planned everything carefully, right down to an airport escort for unaccompanied minors. But Faith had insisted she was comfortable traveling alone. She wanted to show her independence. The flight attendants walked down the aisle, making sure everyone was belted in. Faith looked out the window and noticed the runway stretching out beneath the bright Georgia sunshine. The plane pulled back from the gate and began its slow taxi. She felt a pleasurable rush, akin to the moment you ascend a roller coaster. Soon, the plane's engines roared, and they lifted into the sky. Atlanta shrank beneath them, the highways bending like ribbons. Faith's heart soared. Shortly after they reached cruising altitude, Harriet dozed off. Faith quietly slid her headphones on, scrolled through her phone to pick a favorite playlist, and relaxed. She was just about to lose herself in a daydream, maybe, about her future in politics, or the senator's dinner she'd attend with her mom, when an abrupt jolt rattled her seat. At first, she thought it was turbulence, but then she saw the overhead lights flicker and heard an alarmed muttering from the row behind her. The flight attendants rushed in from both ends of the aircraft, clearly disturbed by something. A moment later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, explaining that there was a minor technical issue, but everything was under control. Passengers relaxed into their seats, nerves somewhat frayed but stable. A full hour passed without further incident. Faith decided to close her eyes. Just as she drifted off, the plane experienced another jolt, this time milder, but enough to cause a stir. Some passengers pressed the overhead call button. One man got out of his seat, claiming something was off with the plane's mechanical systems. The flight attendant politely but firmly asked him to return to his seat. To Faith's relief, Harriet gently patted her hand. "Don't worry, darling. If it was serious, they'd land the plane right now. Planes are made to handle these little bumps in the sky." Harriet's words comforted her, but Faith couldn't stop a subtle, anxious tremor from traveling through her body. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the future, how great it would be to see her mum later that night. She'd likely meet some of her mother's staff, maybe get a quick tour of the Capitol building. Faith pictured the smooth marble floors, the majestic dome, and the sense of history all around her. She wanted to walk those corridors and imagine a day she, too, might serve her state, just like her mother. But at that moment, she had no idea that the biggest problem she would face on this flight wasn't turbulence or a technical glitch. It would be a single uniformed officer, driven by prejudice, who would turn her trip into a nightmare she never saw coming. As the plane soared over the eastern seaboard, Faith tried to soothe her minor anxiety by requesting a small cup of ginger ale. Harriet stirred from her nap long enough to accept a cup of coffee from the attendant. Despite the earlier disruptions, the flight crew was doing their best to maintain a calm atmosphere, moving up and down the aisles with polished smiles. Midway through her ginger ale, Faith took out her phone to glance at some messages. She saw a string of texts from her mother. "Hey, sweet girl, everything okay? Make sure to text me when you land. Proud of you." She typed a quick reply, even though she was well aware that in-flight internet could be spotty. "All good, Mum. Love you." Meanwhile, Harriet, noticing Faith's restlessness, smiled kindly and said, "You know, sometimes taking a deep breath and thinking about something you're looking forward to helps distract from the bumps." It reminded Faith of advice from her mother, who practiced mindfulness whenever the stress of the Senate weighed heavily on her. So Faith closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, and exhaled her anxiety, focusing on the joy of seeing her mum. Suddenly, a murmur arose at the front of the cabin. Faith couldn't see much from her seat, but she heard raised voices. A few passengers exchanged concerned looks. Harriet tilted her head and listened intently. In a matter of seconds, a uniformed officer, someone who was not part of the standard flight staff, stomped into the main aisle. He wore a police badge on his belt. It was unusual to see a police officer mid-flight like that, but then again, some officers fly armed if they have certain clearances. He seemed agitated, scanning the rows with a hardened glare. Faith noticed the flight attendants trying to talk to him, their voices inaudible over the general commotion, but his posture hinted he wasn't really listening. Eventually, he fixated on a seat about 3 rows ahead of Faith. From her vantage point, she could see him bend over, speak sharply to a middle-aged black man in a business suit. The man raised his palms in a calm, diffusing gesture, but the officer's tone became more aggressive. Passengers nearby leaned away, not wanting to get involved, but clearly alarmed. The man in the suit looked baffled, pointing to something in his jacket, possibly an ID. The officer's face hardened, and he wagged a finger at the man, who carefully took out his wallet and displayed what seemed to be some official document. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over the man's face, as though he believed the misunderstanding would soon be resolved. But the officer snorted dismissively and continued pointing, ordering the man out of his seat. "Is that an air marshal?" Harriet whispered to Faith, who merely shrugged, equally uncertain. The officer's behavior felt off, as if he was itching for a confrontation rather than performing a routine check. Soon, a flight attendant approached with the cabin manager, trying to intervene. Their conversation was terse, and the officer refused to budge from his combative stance. He seemed to bark, "I have a tip. I have every right," though his exact words were drowned out by a wave of chatter rippling through the cabin. Eventually, the officer stepped aside, letting the man return to his seat, but his scowl suggested he wasn't satisfied. He continued scanning the passengers, and his gaze fell upon Faith for a moment. His eyes flicked over her, and for reasons she couldn't pinpoint, a chill coursed through her. She looked down at her hands, hoping he'd move along, but he paused. Faith's heart hammered. What did I do? She wondered. But the officer turned away after a moment, stepping further down the aisle. A collective exhale seemed to sweep the cabin. Faith noticed Harriet frowning deeply. "I don't like the look in his eyes," Harriet whispered. "He's on some sort of power trip." The flight attendants tried to keep the peace, offering extra refreshments and maintaining reassuring smiles. The hum of conversation gradually returned to normal. Passengers exchanged theories. Some believed the officer was investigating a crime suspect. Others assumed there was a threat on board. Still, no official announcement came from the captain, and the tension lingered like an electric current in the pressurized air. After another 20 minutes, the plane began a gradual descent, indicating they were nearing Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Faith felt a wave of relief that soon she'd be on the ground, heading straight into her mother's arms. She tried to let the incident pass from her mind, chalking it up to an overzealous cop or some misunderstanding. But in her heart, she still carried an unshakable sense of foreboding. As the wheels touched the runway, Harriet patted her knee in a grandmotherly gesture of reassurance. "We made it," she said softly. Faith forced a small smile in return. She looked out the window at the glimmering lights of Washington, D.C., her pulse quickening at the thought that her mother was only minutes away, possibly waiting at the terminal or in the car outside. Little did Faith know that her real trial was about to begin on the very ground her mother served as a lawmaker. The policeman's gaze and harsh attitude were just the first ominous signs of the turmoil about to descend upon this unsuspecting young traveler. Even now, the wheels were in motion for a collision course that would test the boundaries of racial injustice, political power, and a mother's fierce love. Once the plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign switched off, everyone stood up to retrieve their belongings, filling the aisle with a claustrophobic press of bodies and luggage. Faith craned her neck to peer over the seats. She could see the officer standing near the front, arms folded, watching as passengers slowly made their way forward. He was not engaging in conversation now, just observing, his expression grim. Harriet helped Faith retrieve her bag. "Stay close to me," the older woman suggested gently. The crowd in the aisle made Harriet worried about Faith getting pushed or jostled, but Faith was grateful for the companionship. She stepped into the line, her backpack slung over one shoulder. When they reached the plane's exit, a flight attendant gave them both a polite smile. Harriet turned and gave Faith a playful wave. "I hope to see you in the Senate someday, Miss Faith." Faith laughed softly. "I'll try my best, Miss Harriet. Take care." They separated in the jetway, each heading to different connecting flights or waiting areas. Faith exhaled a breath of relief. Finally, she was on the ground. Spotting her mother was usually easy. Senator Monique Carter was tall, with a dignified posture and a confident stride, which made her stand out in any crowd. But as Faith stepped into the bustling terminal, she didn't see her mother yet, only a swirl of business travelers, families, and staff with signs. She surmised that maybe her mother was held up by Senate duties or traffic. That was normal enough. A designated staffer was supposed to meet Faith at the baggage claim, so she followed the overhead signs, maneuvering through the throngs. The swirl of noise enveloped her announcements about arriving flights, the beep of transport carts, the chatter of people reuniting. Faith scanned the corridor for anyone holding a sign with her name or her mother's name, but saw no one. She quickly checked her phone. No new messages from her mother or staff. She had just settled onto a bench near baggage carousel number 3 when she heard raised voices echo across the terminal. Her heart skipped, recalling the cop on the plane, the tension in the air. She had hoped to leave that uneasiness behind once she stepped off the aircraft, but now the possibility that the confrontation might continue made her cringe. Sure enough, as she turned her head, she saw the same officer from the flight. He was in earnest conversation with 2 airport security personnel, gesturing emphatically. Something about his stance made her wary. Before she could slip away or hide, his gaze snapped to her. Faith felt her stomach constrict. She told herself she hadn't done anything wrong. Why would he target her? But the memory of that scowl in the aisle seat made her pulse thunder in her ears. The officer strode briskly toward her with the 2 security guards in tow. He wore a nameplate, Officer J. Mills. Faith tried not to panic, but her hand trembled around the handle of her carry-on. Passers-by noticed the officer's intense energy and gave him a wide berth. Children clung to parents, uncertain of the commotion. As he reached Faith, Officer Mills barked, "You, stand up." Faith looked around, stunned. "Me?" she asked, voice trembling. "Don't play games," he snapped. "I need you to come with me." Now, Faith felt her legs wobble as she stood. The airport security guards hovered behind him, one clearly uneasy about the confrontation. Anxious thoughts raced in Faith's mind. Did my bag get mixed up with something? Is there some kind of mistake? She tried to speak. "I'm just waiting for my mother's staff to pick me up." Quiet, Mills growled. "We have reason to believe you were involved in a disturbance on that flight. Hand over your ID. Tears pricked at Faith's eyes. "I'm 13. I don't have a state ID, but I have my student ID." She rummaged quickly in her backpack, feeling everyone's eyes on her. She produced a slightly bent plastic card from her middle school. Mills grabbed it from her hand, sneered at it, then asked for something real. Faith stammered, "That is real. I'm only 13. Do you have anyone who can vouch for you?" he asked, tone dripping with condescension. Faith desperately looked for Harriet, but the kind woman was nowhere to be seen. People passing by offered curious, sometimes concerned glances, but no one intervened. Suddenly, she heard an urgent female voice from somewhere in the crowd. "Officer Mills, wait! She's just a kid." A flight attendant who had been on the plane hurried over. Her name badge read Sandra. She stepped between Faith and the officer. "This young lady wasn't involved in anything. I was on that flight, too. She was sitting quietly the entire time." Mills glowered at Sandra. "Stay out of it. I have reason to believe she's a threat." "So, a threat?" Sandra repeated incredulously. "She's traveling alone. There was no problem with her on that flight." But Mills refused to yield. He motioned to the airport security guards and said, "Escort her to a private room for questioning." Before Faith could protest, one of the guards, looking sheepish but following orders, gently took her by the elbow. Fear shot through Faith like an electric current. She tried to stand her ground. "Please, I didn't do anything. My mother, she's a senator. She's meeting me here." Officer Mills snorted. "A senator, huh?" He gave a mocking laugh, eyeing Faith with blatant skepticism. "Right. And I'm the President of the United States. Let's go." A flurry of confusion gripped Faith as she was led away from the public area, tears welling in her eyes. She managed to grab her phone before the guard insisted she put her belongings into a bin for inspection. She tried calling her mother, but the phone only rang and went to voicemail. During the short but excruciating walk to the security office, a swirl of conflicting emotions buffeted. Faith, fear, anger, disbelief. How could this be happening? Why was he targeting her? She hadn't done anything illegal or suspicious. Was it just because of her skin color? That horrifying thought seared through her mind. She remembered reading about racial profiling, about how sometimes people in authority treated black people with undue suspicion or hostility. She never imagined it would happen to her, especially in such a blatant, humiliating way. In a tiny, windowless holding room, Faith found herself face to face with Officer Mills, who folded his arms across his chest, standing as if he loomed over her. The security guards lingered, obviously uncomfortable. Sandra, the flight attendant, had followed them, but was stopped at the door. She heard her own voice quiver. "I need to call my mum," she repeated it, eyes wet with tears. Mills rolled his eyes. "You'll get a chance to call whoever you want, after you answer my questions." The door shut behind him, leaving Faith alone with a man who reeked of hostility, a man who had clearly decided she was guilty of something without a shred of evidence. And Faith, naive and unprepared for this kind of confrontation, felt more helpless than she ever had in her young life. Officer Mills paced the tiny room with a predatory air. Faith struggled to maintain her composure, but waves of anxiety churned inside her. She clutched her phone as though it were a life preserver. The words of her mother echoed in her mind. "If you ever find yourself in trouble, call me no matter what." But the simple act of dialing her mother felt fraught with risk as Mills stared her down. "So, you're going to keep lying about who you are?" Mills said with a sneer. "You said your mother's a senator. Which senator is that?" Faith swallowed. "Monique Carter," she whispered. "She represents Georgia. She's my mum." Mills let out a derisive snort. "So you expect me to believe you're the daughter of a sitting USS senator?" "I wasn't born yesterday." His gaze was ice cold. "You know how many times I've heard criminals' name drop important people to weasel out of trouble?" Faith's cheeks burned with humiliation. "I'm not a criminal," she insisted softly. "I just flew in to meet my mom in DC for an event. I don't know why you're doing this." Mills yanked his phone from his belt and, while never taking his eyes off Faith, began typing. "If Senator Carter is your mother," he said mockingly, "let's see if there's any record of that." Faith couldn't see exactly what he was looking up, but it seemed he was scanning some database or searching online. At length, he grumbled under his breath. "There's no mention of any teenage daughter traveling alone to DC with your name." He looked up, triumphant, as though he'd unmasked a liar. Faith didn't know how to respond. Her mother had staff who usually coordinated these details privately. Of course, it wasn't going to be broadcast on the internet. She tried to stammer something, but Mills dismissed her. "You were on that flight. I got a tip about a suspicious passenger matching your description." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Running drugs, maybe, or stolen property, who knows? But we're going to find out." His words turned her blood to ice. She could hardly breathe. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. One of the airport security guards poked his head inside. "Sir, there's a flight attendant here. She says the passenger's done nothing wrong. She's insisting we let the kid go." Mills rolled his shoulders, annoyance etched across his features. "She'll wait. I'm in charge here." The guard withdrew, clearly torn between following orders and empathizing with the terrified girl in the room. Faith felt a rush of gratitude for Sandra, the flight attendant who was trying to stand up for her, but it only deepened the sense of injustice swirling around her. Mills continued his interrogation. "Open your bag." Faith's trembling hands fumbled with the zipper of her backpack. She spread out her belongings on the table. At the top was the cardigan from her mother, a small makeup pouch, her notebook, and a few snacks. Mills rifled through it, a look of impatience on his face. He rifled through her notebooks, flipping pages, her scribbled notes for an upcoming speech, and some doodles of superhero logos spilled out. Mills looked bored, then stuffed them back in. "What else do you have?" Faith tried to keep from crying. "Just that pink bag, but that's my carry-on with clothes." Mills jerked his head toward the guard, who left and returned with Faith's carry-on. They unzipped it. Inside were neatly folded clothes, a jacket, and toiletries, nothing remotely suspicious. Mills was silent for a moment, as though disappointed he hadn't found contraband. He stepped back, arms crossed, regarding Faith with undisguised contempt. "Why would I get a tip about you specifically?" he demanded. Faith felt her chest tighten. "I don't know. I was just sitting in my seat. I promise." He glared at her for another long moment. Then, as if to fill the silence, he demanded her phone. "Let me see your phone." Faith hesitated. "But that's my private," Mills snapped. "I can get a warrant if you want me to. Hand it over." Tears sprang to her eyes as she handed over the phone. Mills scrolled through her lock screen, tried to open it, found it password protected, and scowled. "Unlock it," he said. Faith sniffled. I have the right to call my mum first." She remembered some mention of constitutional protections from her civics class, how minors still had rights. But her knowledge was incomplete, and in the face of his intimidation, it felt nearly impossible to assert them. Mills tightened his jaw. "Don't make this difficult." He had the guard stand behind her, as if she might try to run. Faith, sobbing now, typed in her passcode with shaking fingers, humiliated and furious. He started poking around her messages and calls. Faith felt a surge of helpless rage. There was nothing incriminating in there, just her chats with friends and her mother. But it felt like a violation. "Nothing," Mills muttered. He found her mother's phone number in the contact list, labeled Mum. He stared at it, then at Faith. "Let's call her, shall we?" He tapped the screen and held it to his ear. For a moment, Faith felt a surge of relief finally. Her mother would clear up everything. But Mills ended the call almost immediately after it started to ring. Straight to voicemail. "Guess your so-called mother can't be bothered." He tossed the phone on the table, ignoring Faith's gasp as it clattered roughly against the hard surface. "We're done here. You're coming with me to the station." The guard at the door cleared his throat. "Sir, we don't have evidence of any wrongdoing. The airline staff says she's just a kid traveling alone. Maybe we should wait for a parent or guardian." Mills glared at him, halting his speech. "I'm not letting some suspect walk free." He grabbed Faith's elbow. "Up." She stumbled to her feet, tears rolling down her cheeks. In that moment, it dawned on her how unstoppable this all seemed. A single officer with a vendetta could tear her life apart, and all because he chose to believe she was guilty of something. She felt alone, powerless. Where was her mother? Why wasn't she picking up the phone? Little did Faith know, word was already spreading through the airport staff about a young passenger being aggressively detained. Flight attendants were whispering, outraged, among themselves. One of them had recognized Faith's last name, Carter, and made a quick connection to Senator Monique Carter. A phone call was placed, frantic and urgent, to the senator's office. The wheels of justice were about to begin a slow but unstoppable turn, and Officer Mills, so certain of his righteousness, had no idea that the very force he believed in was about to come crashing down on him in the form of a formidable, determined mother. Senator Monique Carter hurried through the airport corridors, high heels clicking against the polished floor, flanked by two members of her staff. She had been stuck in a late committee meeting and arrived at the airport later than planned, only to discover that her daughter was nowhere to be found at the designated baggage claim. Panic flared in her chest when an airline representative approached her with hushed urgency. "MAAM, there's a situation with your daughter." That was all it took. Senator Carter's composure shattered. She quickly demanded to know where Faith was being held. The representative shook his head apologetically, explaining that a law enforcement officer had escorted her away. Senator Carter's staffers scrambled to call every contact they had in the airport, from TSA to the local police precinct. Monique's thoughts were a swirl of terror and outrage. How could someone take my daughter? And why? Meanwhile, in a cramped back hallway, Faith was led by Officer Mills and the uneasy airport security guard. Other personnel stepped out of their way, taken aback by the sight of a uniformed officer dragging a crying teenage girl. Some recognized Faith's face from news segments that occasionally featured glimpses of the senator's family. They whispered anxiously, but Mills forged ahead like a man possessed, determined to haul Faith off to an official interrogation area. As they reached a restricted corridor, Sandra, the flight attendant, tried to intercept them. "Officer, please, this is all a misunderstanding," she pleaded. "I'm telling you, there was no disturbance involving this girl. She's a minor." Mills swung around, pointing a finger in Sandra's face. "I'm done listening to you. Interfere again, and you'll be charged with obstruction." Sandra's eyes filled with defiance. She didn't budge until 2 security guards gently moved her aside, but even then, she kept shouting, "This is wrong," at their retreating figures. A short elevator ride later, Faith found herself in a subterranean level of the airport reserved for security offices. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the pale walls. Her tears had subsided into shaky breaths. Every cell in her body longed for her mother. She clutched the cardigan from her backpack, hugging it for comfort. Finally, Mills ushered her into another sterile room, this one slightly larger, with a metal table bolted to the floor. He gestured for Faith to sit, then barked orders at one of the guards, "Stay by the door." "Nobody comes in without my permission." The guard nodded, but his expression showed clear discomfort with the situation. Mills took a seat opposite Faith, steepling his fingers on the table. "You're going to tell me the truth now," he began. "Who are you working with?" Faith stared at him, her mind blank with confusion. "Working with? What do you—" Mills cut her off with a sharp motion of his hand. "Don't play dumb. If you're trafficking something, or someone put you up to it, now's the time to come clean." "I'm not, I swear," Faith cried, her voice cracking. "I have no idea where you're getting this." Her face was streaked with tears again. She was terrified of what he might do if she kept telling him what he refused to believe, that she was innocent. Outside in the hallway, footsteps pounded the floor. Senator Carter had finally located them. She pushed past a stunned clerk and burst into the security office, her staff trailing behind her. "Where is my daughter?" she demanded, voice cracking with maternal fury. A pair of airport security guards looked flustered, exchanging uncertain glances. One tried to explain. "An officer took her in for questioning, ma'am." There was a tip. Monique's eyes flashed. "What tip? Who gave it?" Her staff, likewise incensed, began scribbling notes and making calls. They knew this was a fiasco, waiting to explode in the media if not handled immediately. A mother, a senator, separated from her child by a suspicious officer's overreach. This was big news, and they had to protect Faith at all costs. The clerk pointed to the door of the room where Mills and Faith were. Monique didn't wait for an invitation. She stormed over, rapped sharply on the door, and when she found it locked, she rattled the handle fiercely. "Open this door," she demanded. The guard inside looked to Mills, torn between his sense of protocol and the sudden presence of a very high-ranking official. Mills narrowed his eyes. "Ignore it," he hissed. "We have business here." But ignoring a U.S. senator in a security office was easier said than done. Outside, Monique shouted again, "This is Senator Monique Carter. I demand you open this door immediately." The guard swallowed hard. No matter what instructions Mills gave, refusing a direct order from a senator was an entirely different level of risk. He glanced apologetically at Mills, then unlatched the door. In an instant, Monique was inside. She caught sight of her daughter's tear-streaked face and felt rage flood her senses. "Faith!" she cried, rushing to her side, arms outstretched. Faith bolted from her chair, practically flying into her mother's embrace. She clung to Monique, sobbing hard. Monique stroked her daughter's hair, her face etched with equal parts relief and fury. "It's okay," she murmured. "I'm here." Mills stood, lips curled back in a sneer. "You can't just barge in here," he growled. "This is an active investigation." Monique spun on him, still holding Faith protectively. "Investigation for what? My daughter was traveling alone, and you're terrorizing her. She's 13, for God's sake." Mills bristled. "We had a credible tip about suspicious activity. She refused to cooperate." "Suspicious activity?" Monique repeated incredulously. She looked at Faith. "Sweetheart, did you do anything?" "Anything at all?" Faith shook her head, too overwhelmed to speak. Monique's eyes blazed as she locked eyes with Mills. "You have no grounds to detain her." Mills tried to muster a retort, but Senator Carter continued in a searing tone, "If you have evidence, present it right now. If not, this is an unlawful detention, and I will make sure you're held accountable. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" At that, the officer let out a harsh laugh. "I don't care who you are. I uphold the law. If I say she's suspicious, you uphold the law, but you're harassing a child based on nothing but a vague tip," Monique shot back. "You also forcibly separated a minor from airline staff and her parent or guardian. You better believe I'll be filing charges. What's your name?" He tried to stand his ground, jaw clenching. But then, one of Monique's staffers, a tall woman in a crisp suit, stepped forward. "Officer, your name and badge number, please. I'm here representing Senator Carter's legal interests." She held out a phone recording app, making it clear she was documenting everything. Mills' face blanched. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. "You don't know the kind of mistake you're making," Monique said, voice trembling with anger. "She's my only daughter, and she will never forget this. Nor will I." Faith pressed her cheek against her mother's shoulder, feeling a surge of relief wash over the terror. She was safe now, but the damage was done, and the consequences for Mills's actions were about to begin. The airport security office had never been so tense or crowded. Senator Carter's staffers, legal counsel, and even some curious airport personnel had gathered. Outside the door, more onlookers had formed a quiet cluster, drawn by rumors of a confrontation between a USS senator and a police officer. News traveled fast in the age of smartphones. Officer Mills stood in the corner, arms folded, while one of the senator's legal advisors, a sharp-eyed woman named Gillian, grilled him on the specifics of Faith's detention. "So you claim you received a tip that a young black female passenger was a threat?" Gillian asked, her tone meticulously polite, yet dripping with implied criticism. "Who did this tip come from?" Mills pressed his lips together. "That's privileged information. I don't have to reveal my source in an ongoing—" "Actually," Gillian cut in, "under these circumstances, you do. The senator is alleging that you unlawfully detained her minor child without any probable cause beyond this and tip. In order for us to determine the validity of your actions, we need to know the nature of this tip and whether it had any credibility." She raised an eyebrow. "Unless you'd prefer we file an immediate complaint with the Department of Justice for civil rights violations." Mills glared at her, then looked to the airport security guard, who stared at the floor. Finally, Mills mumbled, "It came in via an anonymous text to my phone." He pulled out his phone, showing them a short, vague message. "Watch out for the black kid in the hoodie, seat 21F. Something's off about her." Monique's face darkened. "That's it? That's your credible tip?" Her voice shook with simmering anger. "And you decided to barge onto the plane and single out my daughter? Did you check any other seats or follow any other leads? Or just the black kid in the hoodie part?" Mills shifted uncomfortably. I also questioned a male suspect, he muttered defensively, referring to the black man in the suit earlier. Monique's staffers shared a pointed look clearly. Race was the common denominator in both instances. Mills had zeroed in on black passengers based on nothing but a racist tip. Faith clutched her mother's hand, still feeling waves of fear receding. Gillian continued her line of questioning. Was your phone personally given out to the public? Are you sure this wasn't a prank call or a malicious tip from someone with prejudices? Mills opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no good answer. The tension was broken by a new voice in the doorway. Senator Carter? Harriet Moore, the grandmotherly passenger who had sat next to Faith on the plane, pushed her way into the office. Her expression was resolute. I need to speak on Faith's behalf. Monique turned, a flood of relief crossing her features. You were with my daughter during the flight, she asked, stepping aside to let Harriet approach. Harriet nodded vigorously. Yes, ma'am. She didn't cause any trouble. She was polite, and we spoke about meeting her mother, the senator, after landing. I wanted to make sure you all knew that. She fixed Mills with a stern look. This officer has harassed her for no reason. Mills bristled. I was just doing my job, he said, though the force in his voice had diminished. The presence of so many witnesses, especially Harriet, the flight attendant Sandra, and the senator's formidable team was eroding his defensive posture. He looked at Faith, perhaps realizing the optics of forcibly detaining a tearful 13-year-old who had done nothing wrong were catastrophic, especially if her mother was a high-profile political figure. Harriet turned to Senator Carter. I'm sorry you had to go through this, dear. Faith is a lovely girl, and she was frightened. I would have stepped in sooner, but they pulled her away so fast. Monique inhaled deeply. She turned back to Mills, her voice commanding but quiet. Officer Mills, as a senator, I demand you apologize to my daughter and release her immediately. Then we'll discuss the further legal implications of your actions. Do it now. Mills's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked toward the guard by the door, but the guard avoided his gaze. Finally, Mills swallowed and said, Fine, don't Miss Carter, I apologize. His tone was stiff, forced. Faith stared at him, her young eyes filled with hurt. He managed a few more words. I was just following up on a tip. I didn't mean for... He trailed off, unable to meet her stare. A hush settled over the room. Senator Carter exhaled a measured breath. She looked at Gillian. The attorney nodded. We'll handle the official complaint. Let's get Faith out of here. Monique slid her arm around her daughter's shoulders, guiding her toward the door. Faith paused, turning back to Mills. Part of her wanted to ask him why. She wanted to hear him say he was wrong. But his sullen face told her enough. He was too steeped in prejudice and wounded pride to give a sincere apology. They moved out into the hallway, where flight attendants and various bystanders parted to let them pass. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some recognized Senator Carter, others recognized the subdued look on Faith's face, a mixture of heartbreak and relief. Harriet gave Faith a gentle squeeze on the arm. You'll be all right, honey. You have a strong mother. Faith nodded, summoning a grateful smile. Thank you, Miss Harriet, she whispered. Next to Harriet stood Sandra, who looked equally relieved. I'm so glad you're okay. I'm so sorry, she said. Faith simply nodded, too drained to speak. Senator Carter's staff led them to a quieter area where they could gather Faith's belongings and check whether anything was confiscated or damaged. Gillian spent a moment ensuring all Faith's items were returned: her phone, her backpack, her carry-on. Thankfully, nothing was missing. Only then, when they were free of the crowd, did Monique pull Faith into a tight hug. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, whispering words of comfort. Faith clung to her, tears rushing back now that the immediate threat had dissipated. I was so scared, Mom, she choked out. He wouldn't listen to me. He took my phone. Monique's eyes clouded with tears she tried to hold back. I'm sorry, baby. This is on me. I was late, and I should have arranged for someone to meet you right at the gate. Faith shook her head. No, it's not your fault. I never knew people could be like that. So hateful. Monique pressed her lips together, emotions warring within her. Unfortunately, there are people who see a young black girl traveling alone and assume the worst, she said softly. But that doesn't make what he did any less wrong. I promise you, I won't let this slide. Their ride arrived, and they made their way out of the airport. Before leaving, Gillian gave them a brief update. We've already filed an official complaint with airport authorities and the city's police oversight board. This is unacceptable, and we'll be pursuing legal action if needed. Monique nodded, her thoughts already churning about press conferences, potential lawsuits, and legislation that might prevent such incidents for others. But in that moment, all that mattered was that Faith was safe and in her arms. She rubbed her daughter's back gently, wishing she could erase the trauma that had been inflicted. As they drove away from the airport, the bright lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled in the distance. Faith stared out the window, replaying the nightmare in her mind. Little did she know the story was only beginning. News outlets would soon latch on to the incident. The public would demand accountability, and in a twist of fate, the officer who had taken such pride in his authority would find himself facing the kind of scrutiny he had never imagined. Karma, in its own relentless way, was already gathering momentum. News of Faith's ordeal filled headlines across media outlets, with many running titles like Senator's daughter wrongfully accused on flight and racial profiling strikes again. Public outrage grew, especially after it became clear that Faith was only 13 and traveling alone. Support poured in for the young girl who had endured such a frightening encounter. At their Washington apartment, Faith watched the coverage on TV, feeling overwhelmed. At an age when she should be focused on school and carefree activities, she was now seeing her face and name broadcast everywhere. Senator Monique Carter tried to keep her daughter calm. "Nobody deserves what happened to you, sweetheart," she said. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to make this right." Monique also recognized, however, that this sudden spotlight could lead to long-term emotional consequences. Meanwhile, the local police department and the airport's security division launched an urgent internal investigation into Officer Mills. Investigators quickly discovered a trail of past complaints against him, mostly from people of color who claimed he had overstepped his authority. Though those complaints had been downplayed or dismissed before, nothing could be swept under the rug this time. With intense media scrutiny and the senator's involvement, the department was compelled to address Mills's actions head-on. Still struggling with sleepless nights, Faith often found herself in tears whenever she recalled Mills's menacing stare and the feeling of isolation in that interrogation room. Monique felt powerless to ease her daughter's pain, despite her own extensive experience dealing with stressful political battles. Ultimately, she decided to hire a professional therapist specializing in adolescent trauma. "Take all the time you need to heal," she told Faith gently. "I'll handle everything else." By the third day after the incident, Senator Carter held a press conference outside the Capitol. She was joined by civil rights advocates and 2 fellow senators who supported her cause. Normally unflappable, Monique's voice quivered with equal measures of anger and sadness. "My daughter was detained based on an anonymous, racially biased tip. Thousands of Black Americans face similar harassment every day. I will propose new legislation to prevent abuses of power, particularly against minors." Applause rippled through the crowd. Reporters clamored for answers. "Are you planning to sue Officer Mills? Will Faith speak publicly?" Monique answered that Faith needed time to recover and confirmed she was working with legal counsel to determine the proper legal action. With backing from multiple social justice organizations, the possibility of a civil suit against Mills became increasingly likely. Elsewhere in the city, Officer Mills watched the press conference on TV. His heart pounded as he saw his name and face displayed so prominently. On social media, many demanded his resignation or criminal charges. Mills felt cornered, but instead of remorse, he insisted he was just doing his job and had fallen victim to political pressure. To him, Faith was a lying kid, and the senator was leveraging her influence to destroy his career. But the investigation revealed a different reality. Previous victims of Mills began speaking out, describing encounters marked by intimidation and insults. Although their earlier complaints had gone nowhere, those same accounts now carried weight because a senator's daughter had experienced a very similar ordeal. Their collective voices turned up the pressure on the department, making it nearly impossible for them to conceal Mills's repeated misconduct. Amid the turmoil, Faith came to a sobering realization about how quickly one's sense of safety can vanish and how deeply prejudice can cut. She clung to reassuring messages from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who reached out with support. Harriet and Sandra also called to check on her, telling her not to lose hope because an entire community stood behind her. Despite the flurry of media attention, Faith found it painful to relive the event. Yet she also understood that her story might shine a light on societal flaws and prompt action for reform. In the end, her family, friends, and supporters agreed on one thing: remaining silent was not an option. While Faith still longed for her old, simpler routine, she recognized that her experiences could help expose larger injustices, encouraging meaningful change. Sometimes, it takes a personal story, especially one involving a child, to awaken public consciousness and urge everyone to step forward for justice. The internal disciplinary hearing against Officer Mills finally took place at police headquarters. A panel of senior officers and a representative from a civilian oversight committee questioned Mills about every detail. He maintained he was just following procedure, but each time the panel challenged him with pointed queries. Why didn't you verify Faith Carter's identity first? On what evidence did you continue to detain her? How were previous complaints against you handled? Mills's responses failed to convince them. Witness statements from Harriet, Sandra, and the black businessman on the plane painted a consistent portrait of Mills's aggressive approach. His record of prior, racially charged accusations only strengthened the case against him. In the past, vague reports or lack of solid evidence had allowed him to evade consequences. But with a senator's daughter as a victim, the process was now under a glaring spotlight. Within a single day, the police department announced Mills's immediate termination and recommended prosecutors review possible criminal charges. A press release declared, "We do not tolerate acts of racial profiling or abuse of power." News outlets swiftly picked up the story, framing it as a rare instance where a problematic officer faced real accountability. Faith saw the headline while studying at home. Her relief was palpable. "Mom, they fired him," she said, setting her phone aside. Monique nodded. "It's the right decision, but it's not the end. There may be a civil suit, and there's talk of possible criminal charges too." Faith's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions. She still felt sadness and anger, but also a sense that justice might actually be served. As anticipated, a civil rights legal team, working alongside Senator Carter's attorneys, filed a class action lawsuit against Mills and the police department. Several of Mills's earlier victims joined, sharing experiences that matched Faith's. Forced to face a flood of evidence and public outcry, the department scrambled to negotiate a settlement. Mills, having lost his job and reputation, faced immense legal and financial strain. In the days that followed, Faith returned to school. Friends approached her with concern, some with curiosity, but most simply hoping she was okay. While adjusting to normalcy, she realized she had changed. She was more cautious, more aware of how deeply systemic prejudice could wound people. Yet her determination had also grown. She told herself, if even a fraction of this attention can spark real reform, it might make the ordeal worth it. A few weeks later, Faith and her mother walked together by the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool. Crisp autumn leaves blanketed the grounds. Staring at the statue of President Lincoln, Faith thought about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous speech. "I wish the world he envisioned were already here," she said softly. Monique gave her daughter's hand a gentle squeeze. "His dream still lights our path, but yes, we have a distance yet to travel." They paused by the water, the outline of the Capitol in the distance. Faith realized that while her personal trauma would never vanish completely, she had tapped into a sense of purpose. Even at 13, she knew her voice mattered. For Monique, the ordeal reinforced her belief that real legislative change was necessary to protect people like Faith, especially the ones who didn't have a senator for a parent. Soon after, the criminal case advanced. Mills faced potential charges of false imprisonment. He entered a phase of deep crisis, jobless, scorned by the public, and confronted with multiple legal challenges. The same authority he had misused had come back to haunt him in the form of official investigations and lawsuits. This stark reversal served as a forceful reminder that no matter how much power one holds, it can vanish quickly when misused for personal bias. In the end, Faith understood that true justice extends beyond a single verdict. It involves transforming the laws and cultural norms that allow prejudice to thrive. Though she remained a teenager with many years of life still ahead, her experience had sparked in her a renewed sense of empathy and activism. She had survived a brutal lesson in how the world can sometimes treat the innocent, and how a united community can help turn one family's nightmare into a catalyst for lasting change. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of courage, resilience, and the fight for justice. Faith Carter's story is a reminder that even one act of speaking out against wrongdoing can spark change, and that we must stand together against prejudice, no matter where it rears its head. If you found this story powerful, or if it moved you to reflect on the issues of racial profiling and abuse of power, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you stand with Faith. Share the video to spread the word about how these injustices can be challenged and overcome. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss another thought-provoking story. Together, let's keep championing equality, empathy, and accountability until stories like Faith's become a thing of the past.